Thank you very much. And I'm also excited just to realize that you're still pretty much alive and still focused in probably what I think is still relevant and valuable work. And I don't know whether you noticed that there is no province in South Africa that has an equivalent of ECSECC. And that should say something, I mean, that how resilient the organization has been over the years. Now, I'll probably respond to all the questions probably, but not in a direct way, but I'll make a few points. I'm cognizant that many people have said a lot already, so I would not be long. I'll really kind of make a couple of points. Now, if you step back and look at the circumstances surrounding the establishment of ECSECC, and I'm sure that has been touched by somebody, but let me just say one or two things there. And if those were there in that period, it was the period of the major strike at Mercedes-Benz. If you recall, there was a huge strike at Mercedes-Benz, and that actually forced a conversation between business, government, and labor, and the NGO sector at the time, just to talk about how, and it immediately took shape from that point on. In part, I think it was to start a conversation about how to build a better labor relations environment in the province. So that was the first thing, that just to say what could make the labor relations framework work in a practical sense. That was probably the very early discussions that we're seized with. But that quickly moved into a different direction, because I think people started saying this discussion is about the auto sector only, and maybe there is a case for looking at the economy-wide conversation, as it were. So right from the beginning then, there were almost like, can I call them, 4 focal areas that immediately became the base upon which we built ECSECC. The first was just this high consultation and engagement between key stakeholders in society. So this is one part of their work, facilitating that and ensuring that you have a continuous conversation. Can I add that it was informed conversation? Because as ECSECC said at the time, at a space where we will do all the research that covers, we will actually engage all the parties concerned, extract what their views are about the issue and our discussion, but also I think you would do research widely. I don't know where, Andrew, you were there already when we dealt with the IDZ discussion. We actually pulled probably global thinkers in the space and to come around, sit around the table, make a determined presentation about how the IDZ could look like, how should we make it different from export processing zones, and et cetera, et cetera. So that was probably that kind of discussion. But the role that ECSECC played was to actually inform the discussion, basically. Come with all the research papers, and that became the basis for the conversation, and it became an informed conversation, as it were. And that's important because I think in many instances, we get into this debate in a positional sense. So everybody takes a position. But I think at the time, what the role that ECSECC did play was to break the positional thing and actually come with informed and data, information, analytics to actually inform the conversation that happened. So that became one part and one platform of what ECSECC became. Immediately because of that, I think 3 other platforms emerged. The one was because of again, we're busy in the middle of renegotiating how the state should be structured, etc., which capabilities do we build, etc. The first was state formation. Immediately, at the beginning. So it was about, and when I say state formation, I'm talking state formation across the board. We looked at the local government, we look at provincial government, we also look at departments themselves. There's a lot of work done in different departments to try and suggest how they are reshaped, etc. We also look at agencies. We did a lot of work at the time. We did a lot of work on state-owned entities in the Eastern Cape and how they are to be transformed and how they are to interface with national, as it were. So the second part, of course, was this thing of state formation. which became, and in many ways, state formation became, for many years later, a defining feature of ECSECC. It almost became like something that ECSECC is known for, like training councillors and training MPs, but also I think informing policy processes. The third area that immediately came into play was social and economic policy. It became very clear that again, most of these issues kind of came back to that platform of economic policy. So we became like, ECSECC became almost like the repository of data and information around the economy in the province, etc. And the third area was social policy. And again, and the interconnection between the three. Because that was at the early stage, we spent lots of time on health policy, lots of time on education policy, and how they interfaced with the economy. So one of the major first products of ECSECC at the time was facilitating a conversation provincially about the provincial growth strategy. It was called provincial, I don't remember, PGDP, it ended up being called. And if Andrew, you were already there at the time, you'll recall how much work was done. But not only work, but how many workshops were kind of facilitated with different stakeholders around the content of that first PGDP draft. It was not a great document, I think, but it was a great document for its time, because what it did was to try to take the conversation from RDP and try to deal with some of the new tendencies and trends that were beginning to express themselves in macroeconomic policy. And of course, try to kind of map out a new path. How do you deal? I remember the term we used, how do you deep understandize the former Transkei and the former Ciskei, and actually integrate it into the national economy and the provincial economy on a different basis. Now, I'm making all these points just to emphasize one point. I would argue that all of those issues are still relevant, in a sense. In some form or shape, all of those issues are still relevant. And many of those questions, I would still argue that they are unresolved, as it were. What made ECSECC successful? Why was ECSECC effective? When I look back, I think we attracted a breed of technically competent individuals and people. Of course, we had our own weaknesses sometimes, but we had a group of technically competent people. But more importantly, we have a group of activists. So there was not a single, I don't remember any single person who had a bureaucratic leaning in the organization, which was in many ways a positive thing, but in many ways it became a negative thing also. Because I think if you're saying state formation is going to be your big area of support and focus, where you're going to sharpen and hone your skills, there has to be some reflection of bureaucracy in the way in which you are structured. So you must have some respectability in the public sector about your capability in state formation, basically. And that requires, and I think that was probably, when I look back, one of the major weaknesses that we had. We had strong intellectual capability, strong activism in the strong political clout, I think, also I must say, but very weak, I think, in terms of just reflecting the bureaucracy that we're trying to change. Just ensuring that there's greater alignment with bureaucracy that probably enables us to be more effective. Andrew, if you recall, one of the projects that we tried at that time was a massive exercise to look at what government is doing. If you recall, whether it's a huge exercise of saying, sometimes we talk about budget, the MEC Finance releases a budget and he reads the budget, but we never kind of do a thoroughgoing study to say, where does the money end? Just follow the money. and right up to the ground, I mean, where it lands, etc., etc. And you'd recall that one of the embarrassing outcomes of the study was that most of the money was being spent in Bishop at the time. So you have a full budget with all these projects, etc. And it became very clear that actually, when you kind of drill down and say, where does the money go ultimately? And ultimately, actually, it became very clear that the first tier is Bishop, the second tier was East London, PE area, and then the rest were getting the trickle down, as it were. Now, being activist, coming with that into presenting this thing to government, we're very enthusiastic that we've discovered something wonderful that needs to be dealt with, and people acted on. I remember, I mean, when the presentation was made, I mean, before we even finished the presentation, people said, hey, can you come back with it after elections? And I think that was the death of that good work that was done. Nobody looked at that document, which I think was a good document, and I think it's still relevant today. But again, it reflects this thing of sitting in the activist terrain without really understanding what dynamics are driving the public sector, and the political side, and therefore trying to align yourself as much as you can with that. Now, I come back to the question, why was ECSECC successful? And I say ECSECC was successful for three reasons, I would argue. I mean, the first is that right from the beginning, ECSECC became a knowledge-based organization. So there was almost strong research capability in ECSECC, and that made it unique in the province, but nobody could actually contest that. So that strong, deep research capability was, I would argue, what made ECSECC unique and made it successful. The second reason I think for the success of ECSECC is probably something that is less obvious now, but was obvious then because the activist part was strong. It's strong lobbying capability. Now, whether you think about major policy positions that the province of the Eastern Cape ever took, all of them have the fingerprints of ECSECC in some form or shape. I mean, they had that, I mean, as it were. And it was because the extent to which the team at ECSECC was able to penetrate and was able to sell some of these products and whatever into different sectors was so powerful, I mean, as it were. I mean, that has its own problem. I'll come back to that. The third area is communication. When we started the publications at ECSECC, they were kind of started as like, because I think Russell liked playing around, and it started this idea of playing around with publications. But that thing quickly swiftly moved into something else, you know, that there was almost like an ongoing program, not just lobbying, but communicating the outcomes of the work. There were public seminars, there were all of these things that kept most of the work and ECSECC's name in the public. And I will argue that those three things, and then if you take those three things and almost like, and also overlay it with the fact that administratively, it had a strong administrative base, basically. I mean, we had strong financial management capability, we had strong HR capability, and all of that. I mean, that we built very early, of course. I mean, I must also say that I think it's also a function of personalities. I mean, the kind of people that we brought in, they were kind of those who were just like bean counters. They would look at what's happening at a financial level, etc., etc. The last point, I think, which probably is going to be, and if I step forward to say what the future looks like. I mean, you know, the problem is that you have an organization that was built at a time of consensus politics. I mean, that's what ECSECC was. It was built in a context of consensus politics. So its culture, its orientation was about consensus building, basically. You know, and now you operating at a time where, of course, consensus also was based at there was strong leadership, the strong understanding of the issues, etc., and keenness to engage intellectually. Today, where you are, or where we are, all of us, are at a context where consensus politics are not popular, at least. And if I'm polite about it, they're not popular. And it's so we're in a context where you have populism very strong, and you have where you have also fractionalist politics very dominant, as it were, and you have also, I think, you have, so the context is that of winners and losers, basically. That's the context in which we are. You kind of are a winner or a loser, basically. I mean, that's what you are. Now the question then is it possible to build an organization that is vested in knowledge building, basically in research solutions and researching solutions for problems, and in providing information and data that is well researched, etc. Is there space for that? I mean, that's probably the question. The second. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that I think there is a very narrow understanding today. At the time when ECSECC was formed, we still talked about the political movement. So the political movement, in the sense that communities, everybody else is part of this like big train that drives transformation and change, and labor and everybody else is actually in that change. If you ask myself today, I would argue that train has long left the station, basically, and again, it left it with consensus politics. But I think we're in a context where the political movement has narrowed itself into almost a party, basically, less focused on building wider consensus and mobilizing communities behind the agenda, as it were, and so on. So that's another problem, because I mean, then the question then is that you're likely to be serving a very narrow political kind of elite, basically, as opposed to the historic context where it was a broader this thing that you would work on. The other debate that probably will continue to haunt ECSECC is that, I mean, when we started ECSECC, there was an understanding that it will be funded, primarily the base funding will come from government. That is, the base funding will come from government, or should I call it Vuyo, foundational funding would come from government. You will then have contribution from the private sector, and labor would also contribute in kind, in many ways. They would contribute in kind in many ways. But also there was an understanding that we will have a donor mobilization drive, or resource mobilization drive, outside of the state. I recall when I left ECSECC, we had the state funding probably the core operations. We had most of the operations programs funded from, I remember it was, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, the Swiss Development Corporation. Am I right? That's the Swiss Development Corporation funded a big chunk of what we're doing. I mean, the whole work on LED, if I recall, the whole reconceptualization of LED and the work that we did in LED in different stations was funded through the Swiss Development Corporation. Then there was work done by an organization called ECSECC, which was basically looking at health issues in communities. That whole block of work was also funded by donors, basically, not through the state, as it were. And there was a lot of international organizations that actually placed people inside ECSECC to actually strengthen the capacity. We went out to GTZ, to everybody else to kind of come in and chip in to do that, as it were. So there was in a sense, much as the base was government, in a sense, I mean, it was strong base and comfortable because it gives us sleepful nights. But you had a lot of, like, I would argue, Andrew, I'm not exaggerating if I say that there was a time when the state was 40% and 60% was donor agencies, as it were, in the funding of ECSECC. But why is that important? Why is that important? Because I think the importance of that is that to be effective, whether it's state formation, whether it's economic policy, whether it's social policy, whether it's mobilizing civil society and other communities, whatever it is, to be effective in doing that, I think you've got to have an element that says you have an identity of your own as an organization. You must have an identity of your own. I recall that there was a time when ECSECC would handle controversial topics on their own. For instance, I'm not sure whether you can have a kind of a big public seminar on the dysfunctionality of the state without reprisals. So I'm just saying that is probably the terrain that you have, your constraint. So if there is any tension you have, it's the tension between a knowledge-based organization that really pursues knowledge, an activist-based organization that actually ensures that you employ as much activists as possible, but at the same time, an organization so embedded in the state and the state machinery. And there are models in the globally of institutions that survive in that model, where they are still embedded in the state, but they still have scope and independence to be able to pursue knowledge and to pursue policy options as much as they can. Now, that is probably your challenge moving forward, in my view. I mean, it is a challenge it's going to be a challenge of integrity, it's going to be a challenge of credibility, but it's also going to be a challenge of impact, being able to impact on development. Audit outcomes in ECSECC, I mean, are a function of, and as I said, I mean, the capability that you have. But I also feel that they are also a function of the fact that you have no money. I mean, quite frankly, if there's little budget, you mess up with small budget, you're found very quickly. So it forces everybody. I think the fact that you don't have money, it focuses you. So there is, in a sense, a very negative thing with being a cash flush organization. And if the ambition is to kind of increase your budget, increase your scope, increase the number of people you have, you must also understand that comes with consequence, because your culture changes immediately. And that's why I would argue that if you're thinking about a model moving forward, you need a model that allows you to be agile, a strong agility, small structure, strong capability, but with an ability to bring in capabilities from outside wherever they are needed, and being able to network with other institutions, as it were, rather than go the route of kind of go mad in raising budgets, go mad in increasing your employee numbers, etc., because that could just be what you need to die. Remain a simple organization, clear focus, high capability in the areas that you choose in, strong networks, because I think so I'm really kind of really cautioning you against growing the organization in numbers and in that sense, but you should grow the organization in influence and impact, basically. And how you do that is, firstly, you do need to really, I mean, I still maintain, I mean, the time of stakeholder, whatever, is still, that work is very important. But I think I would still argue that what defines ECSECC is the research, knowledge, and so on and so on. And therefore, dissemination of that knowledge, communication of those issues, and so on. That's the strength that you have. I would still say that sharpen that so that you are beyond reproach in terms of that. I mean, on all critical areas, whether it's how do you deal with problems of local government, how do you resolve job issues in the economy, etc., etc. Just be there at the cutting edge of the climate change issues. Just be there at the cutting edge of knowledge. Now, obviously, you're not generating that knowledge at ECSECC. So that brings me to my second point. You have to be a highly networked organization. And there was a time when we were. I mean, ECSECC was. So Andrew's right. I mean, when I say networked with particular strategic departments in the province, networked with strategic national departments, highly networked with institutions at a national level, but also networked with global institutions. I think you must go. I think part of what you need to kind of do is to look at, a study on what globally, which institutions would it be easy for you to interact with? What is your relationship with World Bank office in South Africa? What is your relationship with UNDP? What is your relationship with UN in South Africa? So those kinds of things are super, super important. That also talks about corporates, and some of the corporates nationally, not only in the province. You need to think about which are the corporates that can easily, and again, the relationship you build it by just like creating a joint platform with this company and that company to talk about. I was in an interesting conversation a couple of days ago. These guys are looking at food security, and it's a company that is in that space and looking at what are the trends and that kind of stuff. The amount of scientific knowledge that was coming out of that is so big. But how do you create local sourcing networks for food security and for these big JSE-listed companies at a local level, etc.? Those are the conversations that they were having. And I'm just saying that's the networking you have. So really, I'm saying if you can, keep it small. Highly skilled and highly capable, as it were. Secondly, build stronger networks, and that includes universities, companies, and global, national, everything else. Select those very carefully and nurture those as much as you can, and go to battle with them on certain issues, as it were, because that then builds your profile. You benefit from those kinds of interactions. Thank you.